G'day, welcome to the Digger History Podcast. I am your host, Keith Robinson. For this episode, I've chosen a topic that's a little bit different than what I normally do. This one's not about a particular battle or military unit. This one is about the iconic Anzac Biscuit. Now, before I go on, I'm aware that there are some non-Australians that listen to this podcast, so I do need to explain what an Anzac biscuit is. So I'll start first with the word biscuit. So in Australia, a biscuit is, I guess, what in America you would call a cookie. So this is one of those not language but word differences things then that what a word in Australia may mean something different to what it means elsewhere. So I'm aware what what Americans call biscuits is what we would more call a scone. So a scone is like a fluffy, floury kind of I guess thing that you can put. Sometimes they're flavored with fruit in them, or they could be plain and you put jam and cream. We call that a scone. I believe in the US that's called a biscuit. So what in the US would be called a cookie, we would call a biscuit. So that's what we're referring to when we talk about an Anzac biscuit is what in the US would be called a cookie, but you should never call an Anzac biscuit a cookie. And I'll explain all that later in the podcast. There's a story behind that. So now that we've got the language barrier around biscuit sorted, we'll go on with the word Anzac. So without turning this into a podcast about the Anzac story, Anzac stands for Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. And this dates back to World War I when Australians and New Zealanders landed on Gallipoli in Turkey and fought together. The Anzacs landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April 1915, and that date is commemorated in Australia and New Zealand each year as Anzac Day. Now, as I've said, the Anzac story is a whole podcast in itself, so I won't go into too much detail about that. I just wanted to give people that aren't from Australia and New Zealand a bit of background on the Anzac biscuit and what that's all about. So the biscuit itself, its basic ingredients are oats, golden syrup, sometimes treacle, flour, sugar, and sometimes coconut. It's also doesn't have any eggs in it. That's a big factor in being an Anzac biscuit. So growing up, hearing about Anzac legend, um, we we were told that these biscuits were made by wives and mothers and sisters and sent to the Anzac troops overseas. And while there may these particular biscuits may have been sent, there's no actual evidence to suggest that Anzac biscuits in particular were sent to the troops, but biscuits were definitely sent to the soldiers overseas. But they weren't really called Anzac biscuits, and there were various recipes of different types of biscuits. Where the biscuits were really came into the Anzac story was they were often sold in fetes and markets to raise money for the war effort. And these were often called soldiers' biscuits, and there there were various recipes. Different types of biscuits and cakes were sold in these fetes to raise money. Now the soldiers overseas they were actually issued hardtack biscuits, which were very hard, plain biscuits that were made to last and made to withstand being transported long distances. And from all accounts, I've heard these were like extremely hard biscuits. They were you couldn't just eat them like a normal biscuit. You'd break your teeth. So soldiers had very unique ways of dealing with them. They grind them down and mix them with water to make a porridge, or they'd break them up and put them in their stew. And they had some interesting uses too that didn't involve eating them. They were actually made into souvenirs. They'd be written on and made into postcards and Christmas cards and all sorts of souvenirs. And the Australian War Memorial in Canberra actually has quite an interesting collection of souvenirs made out of these hardtack biscuits. And they've lasted 110 years, so that just goes to show how indestructible these biscuits were. But these hardtack biscuits were often referred to by the soldiers as Anzac tiles or Anzac wafers. Obviously tiles because they were quite hard, but wafers was more of a sarcastic name for them because they were nothing like wafers. They weren't delicate, melt in your mouth kind of biscuits. They were exactly the opposite. So the wafer was a tongue-in-cheek name for it. But that was one of the first references to a biscuit being referred to with the name Anzac. Now, in June 1917, in a publication in Perth, there was a recipe published called the Anzac ginger biscuit. But that was nothing like the traditional Anzac biscuit that we know of today. Then later on in 1917, there was a publication in Sydney called the War Chest Cookery Book, and it actually had a recipe for a biscuit called the Anzac biscuit, but it was completely different from the Anzac biscuit that we know now. It was two biscuits. They had eggs in the recipe, which is not in the traditional Anzac recipe, and there were two of them, and they were stuck together with jam and cream. But interestingly, in the same publication, there was a recipe called the rolled oat biscuit, and it was similar to the Anzac biscuit that we know of. And we need to bear in mind too that the recipe for the traditional Anzac biscuit, it could have well been around for long before World War One, but without the name Anzac, as the name Anzac only came about in 1915. So there could be plenty of recipes out there for biscuits similar to Anzac biscuits post 19 pre 1915 that would have been called something different. But the first publication of a recipe bearing the name Anzac that was the same recipe as the Anzac biscuit that we know now was published in 1919 in Dunedin, New Zealand, in the St Andrew's Cookery Book, and they were actually called Anzac Crispies. So this may well be the first published recipe of the Anzac biscuit as we know it now, just called the Anzac Crispy. Now, the interesting thing about this particular recipe was firstly that it's the only recipe that I've seen that gave the option of using treacle instead of golden syrup. And I got a bit curious about this. As far as I've ever known, Anzac biscuits have always been made with golden syrup. So I dived into my research. I went a bit above and beyond, and I actually made some Anzac biscuits using this recipe. And I made two half batches. I made one batch using the golden syrup and another batch using the treacle. And while there wasn't a lot of difference in the taste, I think I actually slightly prefer the treacle version. But having said that, I think I kind of burnt the golden syrup version a bit. I cooked them second and then forgot they were in the oven. And the edges were a bit crispy, so I guess I did make Anzac Crispies in that batch. But the treacle was also a bit harder to manage than the golden syrup. It kind of was a bit gluggier and harder to make into normal biscuit shapes. So there you go. But I've digressed a bit. I don't mean to turn this podcast into a cooking podcast, so I'll get back on track here. Now, in 1920, in Adelaide, a publication called the Argus published almost the same recipe as the Dunedin Anzac Crispies recipe, except it only had golden syrup. It didn't give the treacle option, and they were actually called Anzac Biscuits. So that's the first known publication of the Anzac Biscuit recipe called Anzac Biscuits. Now, all these recipes up into this point don't actually have coconut. They're all missing the coconut. So some Anzac biscuit recipes do have coconut. The first instance of coconut in an Anzac biscuit appeared in 1924. And I guess it depends on which recipe you use. You can use coconut if you like, or you don't have to. But that's really the only real variation on Anzac biscuits since then is some have coconut, some don't have coconut. Apart from that, the recipe's pretty similar. Some people might have their own like ways of making it that they swear by, but the basic ingredients are rolled oats, um, golden syrup, or I guess treacle if you want to use the New Zealand Dunedin recipe, um, flour, sugar, and coconut if you want to put coconut in there. And they don't have eggs. So eggs shouldn't be used in the Anzac biscuit. And why is that? Well, eggs never used to be as easy to come by as they are these days. Back in the early 1900s, you couldn't just go to a supermarket and get lots of things that were out of season. And eggs actually do have a season. Over winter, chickens don't lay as many as anyone who's kept chickens would know. So eggs are kind of like a not rare, but something that's not easy to get. So if you had eggs, you kind of didn't want to waste them in baking, so you wanted to hang on to them and use them for other purposes. And egg production during World War I did actually slow down because a lot of the farm workers were actually overseas um, fighting in World War I. So the Anzac biscuits were made with no eggs, and the golden syrup help to bind the ingredients together. And they're not that difficult to make. Look, I'm no chef, but I can whip up some Anzac biscuits. So I just need to remember that they're in the oven and not burn them. So Anzac biscuits are popular today, over 100 years later, in used as fundraisers particularly around Anzac Day for the Return Services League of Australia, and in New Zealand the Return Servicemen's Association. They're sold as fundraisers. They're often baked in for markets for school fetes, and yes, they're very popular. Some are crunchy, some are soft, and yes, it's definitely something that's been ingrained into the Australian tradition, and I would imagine the New Zealand traditions as well. Now, I did mention at the start of the podcast that you should never call an Anzac biscuit a cookie, and I'll explain why. So not only will, if you call it a cookie, you'll probably get scolded by a very angry Aussie, but it is actually illegal to market Anzac biscuits as cookies. And this is because of the laws concerning the protection of the word Anzac. So in Australia, and New Zealand also has similar laws, it was decided that the word Anzac needs to retain its significance. So laws were brought in even as early as 1916 to make it illegal to use the word Anzac for commercial purposes. So, for example, if you owned a restaurant, you can't call it the Anzac restaurant. And without going too deeply into these laws, because that's probably another podcast in itself, the only exemption from these laws is for Anzac biscuits. So it was decided because the Anzac biscuit is is so ingrained into the Anzac story and the Anzac traditions that they can be commercially produced under the name Anzac biscuits, but there are rules of how you can and can't market them, how they are to be made, and even what shape they are to be. So legally, an Anzac biscuit can be called an Anzac biscuit or an Anzac slice, but never a cookie. The recipe cannot substantially deviate from the traditional recipe. Allowances can be made for allergens, but the recipe can't be changed significantly. You can't throw chocolate chips in there or have like chocolate chocolate coated Anzac biscuits or anything like that. That's a no-go. And they cannot deviate from the traditional shape. So while there's no exact what the traditional shape is, usually a round biscuit, square, rectangular, but no novelty shapes. I'm sure there's allowances made for lack of cooking expertise because the ones I made today weren't exactly round. I tried to make them round, but they didn't quite turn out like that. But they can't be made like novelty shapes that like you see a lot of novelty biscuits made these days. And breaking any of these rules concerning Anzac biscuits can actually cost an individual a $10,500 fine, and the company can be fined over $50,000, and even jail terms for yeah. So don't go calling an Anzac biscuit a cookie. So there you go, a quick little history on the Anzac biscuit. I quite enjoyed researching this one. Not only I got to make some Anzac biscuits myself, but what in my research I found some new topics for future podcasts as I usually do while I'm researching. So I hope you guys enjoyed the podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. As always, if you have any suggestions for future podcasts, please put them in the comments below. If you have any friends that may enjoy this podcast, please link them to it, and please follow, subscribe, um, and comment. Thank you again for listening, and I'll talk to you next time on Digger History.